G'day and welcome to another episode of Spectrum Uncensored. Today I have with me Sam from South East Melbourne. Thank you for being here today.
No worries, thanks for having me.
So tell me a little bit about your life, your profession, your family, that kind of thing.
So I'm an education support worker at a specialist school. I've worked from juniors to middles, currently in seniors. Um, I've always been at a special school. It's been great. I honestly wasn't sure when I first got the job. I was like, oh, I don't know how I'm going to handle it. But if anything, like everything happens for a reason. It's definitely meant to be that I came to work there. And then whilst working there, both of my kids were diagnosed with ADHD and, my youngest has ASD and my oldest is being assessed for ASD at the moment. So it's definitely come in handy having all the extra support that I guess some families don't get. I've been able to talk to colleagues and get extra help that way. So it's definitely been a really good experience working there.
Yeah, it's a good point. Like you're working with people that understand and have been around it potentially a lot longer than you, depending on their experience. And I imagine it's quite a challenging job because you've got a lot of every child's different no matter what school they go to or who they are. But I know that I would think that for the most part, the most challenging part of the job would be behavioural stuff. Like a lot of kids will lash out and things if they're misunderstood or they're overstimulated. My son, he pinches and scratches. He's nonverbal, so that's kind of his way of asking for help in a way, or letting someone know he's not comfortable or wants you to leave him alone. So I feel like that would be the most trickiest part. I guess communication too. I imagine you'd work with quite a few nonverbal or only slightly verbal children as well.
Yeah, so we use like PECs and like sign language as well as like the ACC devices. There's lots of different ways to communicate. And I definitely come across a lot of different behaviours. But my youngest that has ASD, he is also very behavioural. So he lashes out as well quite often because he struggles to communicate his needs. So I deal with that a lot at home. At work, it can be a little bit different because especially with where I work now, being seniors, a lot of the kids are taller than me. I'm quite short. So when they become aggressive, it can be a different story compared to being at home with my youngest who's 3. So it's definitely thinking on your feet a lot. By the end of the day, I'm so brain dead because I've just constantly had to think like really quick and on my feet. I have to think about what's best for myself, my co-workers, and like the other students in the room if something's happening. There's always a lot going on.
Yeah, it's like a lot of hats to wear too, isn't it? Like I often think it really enjoy working in that kind of environment because I've just, I think when you've got even your own kids that are neurodivergent, you kind of develop this passion for it in a way. Like for me, it took a while for it to kind of sink in and set in that I was like, oh yeah, I could be really interested in this and trying to work out ways to better my son's life and things. But now every time I come in contact with a child that has a disability, I just have this like overwhelming need to help them and better their lives. So I feel like it would be a very rewarding job, but at the same time, especially when you've got your own children to deal with at home, I imagine you'd get quite burned out and feel
definitely.
yeah. I mean, that's the thing is people don't realize when you've got your own kids at home, if there's sleeping problems and things like that, and then on top of that you have to go to work the next day and try to function. And as you say, it's a very like high, not stress, I guess it is stressful, but it's just one of those environments that everything is constantly moving, all the parts are moving, and you've got a lot of things to think about non-stop. You can't switch off. My son absconds, so at home and things, it's like you've always got to be thinking or trying to think a few steps ahead of everyone. And when you've got a couple of kids, or 5 or so kids in a room, it's I know that special schools, I don't know what it's like down there, but up here we have only like 5 or 6 kids in a class. And people think, oh, well, that's amazing because it's like, such small classes. But it's like, yeah, but each of those kids are like 3-in-1 deal. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot more going on, and that's why it's only a small class. It's much more complex than just the average child.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah, down here we have two kind of like special schools. So we have like SDS, which is like special development school. So that's for kids who need like a lot of extra support, and like a lot of those kids are like 1-on-1 or 2-on-1. So for those classes there is only like 5 or so in a room. And then for where I'm at, we're dual mode, I believe it's called. So some students do some days at a mainstream school, and then some might do some other days like at my school. But even if they don't do that, there can be a matter of sometimes it's like a mild intellectual disability, or just like some behavior issues. And so with those students, I tend to resonate a lot with, because I see that as what my youngest will be like when he's older, because like academically, so far that I know of, it's not so much an issue. It's just really his behavior.
Yep.
So when I see students with similar behaviors, it's just like I resonate with that. So I want to help you with that. So I know what I'm doing with my son when he gets older.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, so there's two different types, but we have about 12 to 15 in a class.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a good point. Like, I find that being able to, even I've been talking to people that have older children that are nonverbal. It's like it's really interesting to hear their journey, and you can kind of pinpoint where in their journey you're at in that moment, and kind of. I mean, every kid is different, so it doesn't mean the journey is going to be the same or you're going to have the same outcome, but it kind of gives you a little bit of insight into what to expect, or they might have advice that they wish they'd had back when they were in your position, kind of thing. So it's really,
Yeah.
it's helpful to, brainstorm with people that are in similar situations. And I mean, up here, we've got to be eligible for a special school, the child has to be intellectually disabled. Is it the same down there, or is it,
So they go off IQ. So I think SDS, it's about 50 or 60 possibly with the IQ level. I'm not 100% sure on that one. But I'm pretty sure for a dual mode, it's about 70. Like your IQ has to be about 70.
Yeah, I think,
yeah.
up here it's intellectually disabled is anything under 70, I think, from memory.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a prerequisite for being eligible. If you don't have ID, then you can't go to a special school. You've got to have another disability, or they like it to be like a dual disability, like ID plus autism or ID
Yes,
plus ADHD. But that, I find that's quite difficult for families too, because there's a lot of children that could really benefit from a special school environment that aren't necessarily intellectually disabled, but they still have a lot of challenges that and needs that aren't met in a mainstream school. I mean, obviously you've only worked in a special school. Do your children, one of them school aged, isn't he?
Yeah. My oldest is 6.
Yeah, is he in a mainstream?
So he goes to a mainstream school, but they have a specialist campus on the same like block of land.
Yep.
So it's like right next to each other, and it's still classified as the same school. And they do a lot of inclusion work. So like the mainstream campus and the specialist campus do like lots of classes together.
Yep.
So I feel like that's really good. Like it benefits not just like my son, but like a lot of other kids as well. At this point in time, they don't have, I think, like allied health just yet. But by the time my youngest goes there in a couple of years' time, they should. So they're hoping by the time my youngest goes that he can do some days or some things at one campus and then some days at the other one.
Yep.
And then hopefully, because for my oldest, I'm still waiting as well for a cognitive assessment to be done, as well as obviously like the ASD assessment. So I guess depending on all that as well will depend, I guess, on how that special campus can help or what they can do for him in like a mainstream setting still.
Yeah, up here, our mainstream schools usually have a what they call a special education unit or a special education program, and it's sometimes, I mean, for the school that my son originally went to, that was a building that was on the same property as the mainstream school, but he was in a mainstream classroom. It's just that they were able to go to the special education unit if they needed to. And I think they did some one-on-one work and things like that in that setting as required. But for the most part, they had access to the school as a whole. But it
Yeah.
was definitely, for my son, it was a challenge having so many kids in a class. It was like, 23 children in a class, so that's quite overwhelming. I think that's
Yes,
pretty
same for my son.
Yeah, I think that's pretty overwhelming for any child, to be honest.
Yes.
Like, it's, going from being like at home and getting everyone's attention to going into a classroom full of children. Unless you were from a big family, that's pretty daunting.
Yeah, that's
But yeah,
true.
it's definitely, like anything, every child has their challenges. But it's really, yeah, it's definitely a journey. And we were chatting just before we started about the whole neurodivergent pipeline of eventually figuring out that you're neurodivergent yourself. And I mean, it comes from somewhere, doesn't it? It doesn't just appear out of thin air. So it's
Yes, exactly.
yeah, it's an interesting journey, and it's one of self-discovery. And it's just, yeah, if I'd
Yes, it's definitely been like it's like I think it's about like my kids, and then along the way, it's kind of just like, hey, I resonate with that, and then this, and then some of the specialists are just like, oh, have you been assessed for like ASD or ADHD? It's like, no. It's like, oh, maybe you should. Like, oh, okay.
so you're trying to tell me something.
Yeah. They're like, oh, this kind of like goes with this. Maybe do some research on that and have a look at getting tested. I'm like, oh, thank you. Maybe.
Yeah, I've got a friend that's quite a bit older, in his 60s, and he's he's been listening to my podcasts, and he's like, I've got a few questions. And I was like, oh, okay. And he's like, oh, there was one lady, she was talking about some stuff, and I do all those things. I'm like, uh-huh, uh-huh. And I was like, do you think maybe? And he's like, oh, maybe. He's like, how do I find out? And I was like, I'll talk to some people and we can organize something. But yeah, it's just like, even, people in their 60s are like just having epiphanies, just listening to other people's stories and going, oh, that sounds very similar to mine. And
Yeah.
I don't know, do you have a lot of friends that you feel the same way? Like, I mean, all my friends are
Well,
definitely neurodivergent.
my brother, who I get on with quite well, we're quite close. Like my younger brother, he has ASD and ADHD. And when I've even just like talking to my mum, she's like, oh, yeah, I guess I can see where you've got traits now, but because you're a girl, it wasn't really like a thing when you were younger. So she's like,
Yep.
yeah, you're probably on like the spectrum somewhere now. I was like, oh, thank you for that. But my best friend has ADHD, and yeah, we click pretty well. But yeah, when I think about it, actually, I think a lot of my friends have ADHD at least.
Yeah. Yep.
Especially with where I work. Like I'm not the only one who's had like that self discovery along the way in like the career. There's
Yep.
been quite a few people who have started working where we work, and then along the way they're just like, oh, this actually sounds familiar. And like, I do this and I do that. And so then they've got like assessed, and they all come back with like ADHD or ASD or both. And now I'm also along that journey, and it's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense.
I feel like that's why you're drawn to those kinds of careers and things too. It's almost like a calling, and you see things, even children, like you'll go, oh, I did that when I was that age. And that
Yeah.
kind of starts to, even when my son was diagnosed, we started looking at each other, my husband and I, and going, okay, well, he gets that from me. and he gets that from you, and like, and next minute it was like, uh-oh. and you know, we were all diagnosed now, we're all autistic, and then I'm ADHD, my son's ADHD, my husband's ADD. So it's it's definitely just one of those things. And like, I find that everyone I've spoken to that works as a teacher aide or a support worker in a special school setting, I've been told multiple times that the people that work there want to be there, because if they didn't, they wouldn't last, because it is a very different environment to a mainstream school
Oh, definitely.
in
Yeah, I
that
definitely
profession.
like there are some days where I'm just like, oh my god, this is so much, because you get so invested in like certain students, especially when you've got students from like trauma backgrounds. If they've got stuff going on at home, or and like they bring it into school, and like you just get so invested in like helping them as much as you can, but you can only help them to a certain extent before it's like out of your hands. Like there
Yeah.
are some situations where you just can't help but get really involved, and it's really draining. Um, but within saying that, even with students who don't have like trauma backgrounds, just having them at school, like I really enjoy being around them. Like the senior students that I was with this year, and that like, I'm going up with as well next year, I enjoy being around them. They make work, like some days their attitudes can be a bit meh, but I genuinely enjoy being around them. Like they're a really good group of kids, and it's really fun to hang out with them as well as guide them, I guess, to where they need to be. So they definitely make work, like they definitely make it good to come into. It's not a drain. It's yeah,
Yeah.
I definitely enjoy going into work and seeing all those kids and hanging out with them, as well as like the teachers that I work with are really great. So it's really great environment.
Well, I've read a lot of like myths lately. There was one that popped up about ADHD and how people with ADHD don't have empathy. And that's just ridiculous. I think it's actually the other way around. We're very empathetic,
Oh,
and that can
definitely.
be, yeah, and we can be quite emotional. And that's, you know, and that's what kind of, when you were saying that you get quite involved and things like that. And it's hard. Sometimes it's really hard to separate like personal from professional, when especially when it comes to kids, because you, if you're in that profession, you genuinely want to help those children. So
Yeah,
um, I think that's really hard to see children struggling, and as you're building a relationship and some rapport with them, you, I don't know, I feel like if I was in that position, all of a sudden they'd be like all my adopted children, and I just want to help all of them and mother them and, you know, nurture them. Like, I think, yeah, I'd be just too full on almost, because I'd just want to be, you know, protecting them. I'd be very protective. um and yeah, so I definitely understand what you're saying with that. It'd be very hard to disconnect. um
yeah, it's
yeah,
definitely
that
like
side
that.
of
And then
things.
like just a lot of them, like it's good to hang out with them and build that like rapport as kind of like a friendship, but they know when you need to be professional. And it's really good for some of them who are, I guess, a little bit higher than others. They understand that. They understand, like, oh, okay, well, Sam can help me with this and get along with this. We can have a bit of a joke, bit of a laugh, muck around a bit, but I still need to do my work. Or if I'm swearing or being rude, then she'll pull me up on it.
Yep.
So there's definitely a few of them. They don't like that authority as much. They tend to play up more with like that real, like being strict or like generic teacher student kind of thing. So you have to, like each student is different, because some of them do respond better to that. So it's kind of like you have to tailor how you are to each student,
Yeah, definitely.
which can
Like, they're
be very
also,
interesting.
yeah, they're also different. Like, if you've got things like ODD at play or PDA at play, they all have
Yeah,
very different kind of push pull symptoms, and it's tricky. Like, obviously every child is different, whether they're neurotypical or neurodivergent, but it's definitely more complex when it comes to that neurodivergent side of things, because neurotypical children, at least generally speaking, understand that authority type thing and that respect. And it's not through any neurodivergent child's fault that they're not understanding the respect side of things. It's just that they process things differently. So it's really hard to, it's a lot of the time there's no malicious intent for the most part. So
they can't help it. So
yeah, and you need to change your frame of mind. Yeah, it's really tricky to change your frame of mind with that. Like even with my son, trying to work out when he's being malicious and when he actually can't control it. It can be really tricky. And then even trying to work out things for discipline can be quite tricky. So I imagine in a school setting that would be hard too, because sometimes disciplining a behavior is actually doing more damage than being helpful. So I don't envy those kinds of positions of, my brain's pretty fried at the best of times. So I've always thought maybe when my son's in high school and, hopefully things are settled a little bit. I always say that every year I say when they settle a little bit, but I don't know if we'll ever get there. But yeah, I'd love to go into a special school and help kids that are younger that, especially with my own knowledge as well. And I feel like you're kind of in a unique position of it being the other way around, that you're kind of learning from your experiences for your children instead of the other way around. But like you said before, with you thinking you're neurodivergent and, that girls and boys are very different when it comes to that kind of thing. It's nice to see that they're starting to recognize that for this generation of children. I'm noticing more and more girls are being diagnosed at a younger age. I've only spoken to one woman so far who was diagnosed as a child. So for me, it was like a unicorn because you don't really find those. So that was quite interesting. I mean, her brother was diagnosed first and they kind of worked it out from there. But it's interesting that it was so difficult. I mean, there were so many myths. It was a boy's disorder and it was, girls couldn't have it. And it's quite confusing for people to wrap their head around that we're pretty much whatever the boys' symptoms are, ours are the opposite. So and it's interesting. I mean, it's an interesting thing, even for research, trying to work out why exactly that is the case. But I mean, we're built differently, females and males. So it's it's definitely, it's hard because it was for boys. It's like, oh no, there's nothing going on there. They're just boys. That's a boy thing, and we've got that a lot. We got that a lot with my son. It was like, oh, he's just a boy. I'm like, no, I don't think that's just it. So it's you're met with a lot of pushback from people when you're having your kids diagnosed and things like that. Like, usually like older generation that I had some family members that didn't really believe that autism was real, and that was tricky to navigate because it was like, well, no, it is, and as time went on, they started to realize, oh, okay, no, it is real. Your child is not tracking, neurotypically through life. When they're young and little, it is hard, and that's why they normally don't diagnose too young. But I don't know what it was like for you, but I didn't really see any red flags, so to speak, for my son when he was young. In hindsight, there was some sensory issues with food, but I just kind of was like, oh, he just doesn't like that, or he's being dramatic. You know what babies are like. Like they'll try something and they're like, oh, that's gross. So that, just things like that, I didn't really see as red flags at the time, but in hindsight, that's sensory issues. But other than that, he tracked normally for crawling and walking and all that kind of stuff. Was it the same for your kids?
Yeah, well, for my oldest, I never picked up on any differences until he started school this year in prep. And then looking back now, it's because we're very common. Like we're very much like the same person. And so then
Yep.
that's like a big thing that's made me realize, oh, maybe I do have ADHD, because when I've gone through like the diagnosis for his ADHD, they're like, oh, does he do this? Does he do that? Does he do this? And it's like, yes, yes, yes. They're like, oh, how long has he done this? Like, oh, always. It's like, then why did you never think to do this earlier? It's like, because I thought it was normal, because I'm also like that. Whereas for my youngest, I had him during COVID.
Yep.
So I noticed that he was just like a really difficult baby. He was never settled. He cried all the time. And like, I understand like babies are like that anyway, but I just had a feeling that something was different. And we didn't see any of the maternal health nurses because of COVID. Everything was over the phone. And whenever I mentioned it to them, they were just like, oh, maybe it's like colic or like acid reflux. And so I went through all different formulas, all different types of medication, and nothing was working. And then I just kind of got told, oh, it's just because he was born during COVID. Like, I don't understand what that has to do with anything, but okay.
He doesn't know any
So
different.
it was definitely no, exactly. And then like taking him out, so he struggles a lot with transitioning. They're like, oh yeah, it's just because he was born during COVID, so he stayed home all the time. Like that's not it. So that was very frustrating. And then we moved down to like South East Melbourne, and I found a pediatrician, and I went to her and I explained everything. I was like, please help me. Everyone's saying it's because of COVID and that there's nothing wrong, but I'm like, I honestly have like just one of those mum feelings that something's different. And so yeah, he was 2 years and I think 8 months when we started the ASD assessment. Um, and yeah, every like the psych that we saw and the speech pathologists were just like, he definitely has ASD and ADHD. And I'm just like, okay. So then I took that back to the pediatrician, and she's like, oh, look, it's too young to diagnose him with ADHD. But yeah, he's definitely got ASD, and it's like level 2/3. So I was like, okay, cool. Finally, someone's actually seeing what I'm seeing, which is great. But the ADHD was still a big issue. So she pushed, thankfully, for an early diagnosis of that as well, which has been very helpful. So
Yeah,
she was like she was very helpful because she's done both of the kids, but I feel like it was definitely smoother with my youngest, whereas I'm finding it's a little bit trickier with my oldest, especially dealing with like NDIS and like the age and the cutoff because he's 6, and yeah, it just seems to be a bit more tricky with him.
yeah, and you're right. Like they usually won't diagnose ADHD till they're school age, 5 or 6.
Yeah,
Usually that's when my son was diagnosed. But you're right. You got to go with your instinct. Like we have that gut instinct, and I have always regretted not following my gut instinct. When I have those feelings, 9 times out of 10 we're right. So we know our child better than anyone. And you made a good point with going through that diagnosis process for your children and talking about, well, that's normal for me because I do those things too. Had we known beforehand that we were neurodivergent, it would have been a lot clearer to us a lot earlier on that our children were. So
yeah,
people, yeah, being diagnosed first, and I guess our children, their generation are going to have that benefit. They're already diagnosed, so if they decide to have children, they can make an informed decision. Okay, my children are most likely going to be neurodivergent too, and knowing what to look for. Because yeah,
yeah,
if we're all neurodivergent, that's our normal. So we don't think it's weird. Like
yeah,
that means
exactly.
neurotypicals are weird. And I feel like it's only a matter of time before we're actually the neurotypicals and the neurotypicals and the neurodivergent, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
it's
very
it's going to
true.
flip eventually. We're going to take over the world. It's already happening. But if you had some advice for a parent that was going through the diagnosis process with their children, what advice would you give?
I would say to look for a good pediatrician who's going to support you. Because sometimes, like, even from what I've read, there are some who will push you back. And there was one that I was actually reading this morning. she was told like, oh, her son wasn't autistic because they weren't nonverbal. And so I think that's a
Okay.
bit, I could definitely feel her frustration there. But yeah, definitely finding a good pediatrician and getting on wait lists really early for like OT and speech because it can take quite a while. So what I did is I put our names down for everywhere, and we've had to travel for the past year quite a distance to see his therapist. But now I'm finding places closer because I've been on waiting lists. So it might seem annoying to have to do all the traveling, but it definitely pays off. As well as having a really good support system. Um, like my family, my friends, my partner has been super supportive, and it's definitely made the process so much easier. As well as obviously where I work and having the extra support, but not everyone has that advantage, unfortunately. But yeah, definitely reaching out to people. I find Facebook groups are also really beneficial. I'm on so many Facebook groups for Victoria, and it's been so helpful. Like I've got so many tips. I've found different like allied health specialists. Um, so yeah, really finding a good support network is really beneficial.
It's definitely worthwhile being connected pretty much in every facet
Yeah,
of life in that regard. And yeah, thinking ahead, it's never too early to start planning what school you're going to send your kids to, or
yeah,
what therapist you're going to go to, because it does actually come up really quickly. And people used to always make fun of me talking about, oh, what school, high school is my kid going to go to? They're like, that's like 10 years away. I'm like, but you need to be prepared for these things, especially with neurodivergent kids. So that's
yeah.
definitely some very good advice. But thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely awesome chatting to you and getting to know you. So thank you for popping in and having a chat.
That's right. Sorry about the dog.
That's all right. He's just coming in to say goodbye. Awesome. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you.
Take care.
You too. Bye.